The war that ended in 1945 was not just a conflict of armies and nations. It was a war of ideology, and for the millions of young German women who served the Reich, that ideology was the air they breathed. It was a rigid, merciless hierarchy, where their primary duty was to uphold the racial purity of the Aryan state. They were taught that the world was divided into the Herrenvolk, the master race, and the Untermenschen, the subhumans. The Jews, the Slavs, and most certainly the black race, were positioned at the very bottom of this moral ladder. They were not just enemies, they were a biological threat to be extinguished. By 1945, over 500,000 German women served as auxiliaries, telephone operators, anti-aircraft spotters, nurses, and clerks. They were the cogs of the war machine. And as the Reich collapsed, these women were fed a final, desperate dose of propaganda. The message was calculated to prevent surrender. The Allies, particularly the Americans, were bringing vengeance. But the most terrifying threat was reserved for the Untermenschen. They were told that if captured, they would face unspeakable acts of brutality from the mongrelized and primitive elements of the Allied forces. These men were not soldiers. They were demons sent by the enemy to defile and destroy the German race. This fear of the other was a psychological weapon, designed to make them choose suicide over capture. They expected to be met by snarling, hate-filled white officers eager for retribution. They expected to be humiliated, starved, and abused. They expected the end of their lives to be ugly and filled with the violence that their own regime had glorified. But the moment of their capture, the moment the reality of defeat collided with the lies of the Führer, brought a shock that was far deeper than mere physical fear. It was a shock that struck at the core of their identity. The train carrying hundreds of these auxiliary personnel rolled to a stop at a desolate detention facility outside Rouen, France. This was the moment of truth. This was the moment the demons were supposed to appear. The women flinched as the heavy metal door slid open with a screech. The light was blinding. They covered their eyes, bracing for the inevitable shouts, the rifle butts, the hate-filled commands. What they heard was a voice speaking clipped, professional English, followed by a translation into firm but not cruel German. "You will exit the train in single file. You are now prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. No harm will come to you." The guards were not the white, arrogant officers they had been trained to expect. They were the men the propaganda had called savages. They were the soldiers of the 452nd Quartermaster Group, or the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, black American servicemen, part of a segregated army that had fought for a country that barely recognized their rights. For the German women, the sight was a complete and utter ideological collapse. The men who were supposed to be the embodiment of racial inferiority stood before them, impeccably uniformed, carrying themselves with a professional discipline that contradicted every Nazi lesson they had ever absorbed. A woman named Hilda, a former telephone operator, later recounted the moment in a declassified report. She had been taught that these men were lazy, dirty, and incapable of order. Yet the camp they were led into was the cleanest facility she had seen in months. The men managing the intake were methodical, their movements precise. Hilda, expecting a slap, a shove, or a hateful gaze, was instead met with a simple, detached professionalism. A sergeant checked her name off a list. He did not sneer, he did not mock, he simply moved on to the next task. The shock was not the fear of violence, but the absence of it. The absence of the expected hate, the absence of the promised savagery. The Nazi regime had prepared them for cruelty. It had not prepared them for order. The soldiers, many of whom had faced intense racism and discrimination from their own white comrades, treated the German women with a detached adherence to the Geneva Convention. They were strict, but they were fair. They enforced the rules without cruelty. The immediate realization was a crushing blow to their worldview. The men they had been told were demons looked exactly like men. This was the moment the seed of doubt was planted. The moment the women realized that the people they had been taught to hate were in fact the only ones offering them a sliver of human dignity. The initial shock of the encounter quickly gave way to a deeper, more corrosive confusion. The women had been prepared for torture. Instead, they received protocol. They had been prepared for starvation. Instead, they received sustenance. The greatest blow to the Nazi worldview came not from a political lecture, but from the mess hall. The women were led to long tables and served hot meals. Meat, potatoes, real coffee. Food that they hadn't seen in years. Food that their own families back in Germany were now only dreaming of. A former clerk named Greedy stared at the slice of white bread on her plate. White bread, a luxury reserved for the highest ranks of the Reich. Now it was being handed to her, a defeated enemy, by the very people her government had labeled Untermenschen. She later wrote that the taste of that bread was the most humiliating thing she had ever experienced. It was proof that the supposed master race was incapable of feeding its own people, while the inferior race lived in a world of such abundance that they could share it with their defeated enemies. The black soldiers enforced the rules of the Geneva Convention with a discipline that was almost insulting in its humanity. They ensured the women had warm blankets, access to basic medical care, and clean washing facilities. This professionalism was a subtle, devastating weapon. Many of these black soldiers had experienced the very worst of American racism, segregation, humiliation, denial of basic rights. Yet they did not use their power over the German women to exact revenge or even to express the bitterness they surely carried. They treated them as human beings because the rules demanded it, and perhaps because their own experience with injustice informed their actions. The women observed the interactions among the black soldiers themselves, the camaraderie, the laughter, the casual respect between men who were fighting for a country that did not fully respect them. This was a stark contrast to the brutal, fear-driven hierarchy of the Wehrmacht. The truth began to sink in with every small, mundane act of decency: the hot water in the showers, the clean, real soap, the gentle professionalism of the medical checks. These things were not acts of love, they were acts of civilization, and that was the core of the psychological crisis. The Nazi ideology had claimed that the Aryan race was the sole bearer of civilization, yet here they were, witnessing the subhumans upholding the very standards of dignity and order that the Reich had so spectacularly failed to maintain. The women began to ask the terrifying question in the silence of their barracks: if our enemies are capable of this level of order and mercy, then what does that say about the men who told us they were demons? The propaganda was not just a lie about the enemy, it was a lie about themselves. The barracks became a pressure cooker of cognitive dissonance. The women were trapped between the reality of the food on their plates and the ideology embedded in their minds. The debates erupted every night after lights out. Some, the hardliners, clung desperately to the old beliefs. "It's a trick," insisted Ursula, a former radio operator. "They are being kind now to weaken us, to make us grateful. The propaganda is true. They are just waiting for the right moment to strike." But the constant, relentless kindness was harder to fight than any cruelty. The turning point for many came with the re-education program. Allied officers, aiming to denazify the prisoners, showed them graphic footage from the concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, skeletal bodies piled like cordwood. The sheer horror of the system they had served. The revelation was devastating. The women had been taught that the war was about defending civilization. They were now being shown that their own side was the source of unimaginable barbarism. And the guards who facilitated this difficult, painful confrontation, the black American soldiers. A former auxiliary nurse named Lottie described the moment. "The American officer showed us the films. We cried, we vomited, we denied it. But when a black soldier, one of the men we were taught to despise, handed me a clean handkerchief, I looked at him, and I realized the real demons were not the ones who captured us. The real demons were the ones who gave us the orders." The ultimate shame was the realization that the Untermenschen were showing them the very dignity and humanity that the Herrenvolk had so brutally denied to millions. The moral compass had been flipped. This realization wasn't just guilt, it was a profound personal sense of betrayal. They had sacrificed their youth, their belief, and their future for a lie. And the people who were helping them pick up the pieces were the very people their leaders had told them to eliminate. The struggle was internal. How do you maintain loyalty to a state that lied to you about everything, while accepting life from the hands of the people it told you to hate? The only way out was to admit the truth, and the truth was that the war had ended, but the war against the lie had just begun. The story of the German women POWs and their black American captors is a unique footnote in history. But its lesson is universal. The black soldiers of the Allied forces, fighting for a country that still segregated them, understood the meaning of dignity denied. They were men who had been called less than by their own nation, now holding the moral high ground over the soldiers of the supposed master race. They did not need to exact revenge. They did not need to gloat. Their adherence to the rules, their simple professionalism, their lack of hatred, that was a victory more profound than any battle won on the front lines. It was a victory of character over ideology. When repatriation began, the women who returned to Germany were fundamentally changed. They had been exposed to the ultimate paradox. The people they were told to hate were the ones who had shown them what humanity truly meant. The ideology of the Reich, which had demanded their loyalty and their lives, had been destroyed not by bombs, but by the smallest acts of decency: a warm blanket, a slice of bread, and the professional conduct of a man whose race they had been taught to despise. Hilda, the former telephone operator, later reflected on the sergeant who had processed her. "I never learned his name," she wrote, "but I will never forget his face. It was not a face of a demon. It was the face of a man who was simply doing his job, and doing it with more honor than I had ever witnessed in the ranks of the Reich." The true weapon against propaganda is not counter-propaganda, it is the encounter. It is the moment a person is forced to reconcile a lifetime of lies with a single, undeniable truth. This story is a crucial reminder that hatred is a learned vulnerability. The Nazi regime relied on the women, never seeing the eyes of their demons. They relied on the fear of the unknown. But once the women saw the professionalism, the order, and the essential humanity of their captors, the entire structure of the Reich's racial lie crumbled. The question is not, how did the Allies win the war? The question is, how do you rebuild a conscience that has been shattered by a lie? And the answer, often, is through the quiet, consistent decency of the people you were taught to hate. They were told to expect demons. They were treated with dignity. This story proves that the most devastating weapon against hatred is the simple act of seeing another human being clearly. If this story shattered your view of history and the power of propaganda, do us a favor and subscribe. Hit that notification bell, because here at WW2 Whispered Stories, we uncover the impossible choices and the profound moral lessons that the official histories leave out. Thank you for watching.